There is a precise moment in every human being's life. Everything you believe to be to crumble. It's not gradual. It's not a slow erosion of certainties. It's a collapse, a rupture, an abyss that opens between the world you knew and the reality that has always been there, patiently waiting to be recognized. Carl Jung experienced this moment, and when he plunged into that abyss, when he truly looked into the void that opened before him, he discovered something that would forever change how humanity understands the mind, the soul, and the very meaning of human existence. What he found in that darkness was not chaos. It was order. It was intelligence. It was a wisdom so profound, so ancient, so vast that he spent the next 50 years of his life trying to translate this discovery in words that could be understood by the rational. Jung was no ordinary man. He was an explorer, a cartographer of the invisible, an archaeologist of the human psyche who dedicated his entire life to unearthing the treasures buried in the depths of the unconscious mind. But unlike Freud, his mentor and later his intellectual rival, Jung did not see the unconscious as a dark basement full of repressed desires and buried traumas. He saw something completely different, something that was simultaneously more frightening and more inspiring. Jung saw the unconscious as an infinite ocean, a living universe, a repository of ancestral wisdom that contained not only his own personal traumas, but the collective memory of all humanity. It was as if each of us carried within ourselves, in the depths of our psyche, the accumulated experience of thousands of years of human evolution. And when you manage to access this memory, when you manage to establish a bridge between your conscious ego and this ancestral wisdom, something extraordinary happens. You gain access to a form of intelligence that completely transcends linear and rational. But how did Jung arrive at this understanding? How could a man trained in the rigorous scientific tradition, taught to distrust anything that couldn't be measured and verified, develop such a profoundly spiritual, radically mystical vision? The answer lies in his own journey. Jung didn't just study the unconscious, he descended into it. He confronted his own demons, he conversed with his own shadows. And when he emerged from that journey, when he managed to integrate what he had discovered, he had an understanding that no psychology book could have given him. He had a lived understanding, embodied, one through the fire of personal experience. Have you ever stopped to think about why some people can solve seemingly impossible problems in a matter of minutes, while others, equally intelligent, take weeks or months? Have you ever wondered why some individuals seem to have access to a creativity that completely transcends rational logic? Why some manage to make decisions that turn out to be absolutely correct, even without having enough information to justify them rationally? The answer that conventional science offers is always the same: genes, innate intelligence, natural talent. Something you either have or you don't. Something that is fixed, immutable, determined at the moment of your. Jung knew that this was a lie. Well-intentioned lie, perhaps a lie nonetheless, because the truth was much more disturbing. The truth was that the speed of your brain, the creativity of your mind, the wisdom of your decisions, none of that was fixed. None of that was determined. All of that was a choice. A choice you made at every moment, consciously or unconsciously, to access or not that part of yourself that Jung called the unconscious. Think of a time when you had such a strong intuition, so clear, so absolutely certain that you simply knew it was true. You couldn't rationally explain why. You had no logical evidence. You had no data to justify that. You knew. You simply knew. Maybe it was about a person. Maybe you met someone for the first time and knew immediately that something was wrong. Something didn't add up. Something you couldn't trust, even if that person was being perfectly polite and kind. Or maybe it was about a decision. Maybe you were about to take a path, to make a choice, and suddenly a silent voice inside you said, "No, don't do that. Don't go that way." And you followed that voice and later discovered that you had avoided a disaster. Or maybe it was about a creation. Maybe you were working on a problem, and suddenly, when you stopped thinking about it, when you let your mind rest, the solution simply appeared complete, perfect, as if it had already been there, just waiting to be discovered. This wasn't your conscious mind at work. This was your unconscious mind communicating with you. This was that vast intelligence, ancestral wisdom, that archetypal pattern that Jung called the collective unconscious, trying to convey a message to you through a channel that completely transcends rationality. And here is the secret that Jung treasured throughout his life. When you learn to trust these, when you learn to listen to these messages from the unconscious, when you manage to establish a genuine dialogue with that part of you that is exponentially faster and wiser than your rational mind, you gain access to a speed of mental processing that is simply supernatural. But there is a problem. A profound problem that Jung understood very well and that troubled him throughout his life. Most people have been taught to do the exact opposite. You have been taught to distrust your unconscious. You have been taught to value only logical, rational, and verifiable thought. You have been taught to suppress your instincts, to ignore your intuitions, to dismiss your dreams as irrelevant or as mere neural noise. You have been taught to distrust anything that cannot be rationally explained. And when you do this, when you systematically reject the voice of the unconscious, when you create a division within yourself between what you believe to be rational and what you believe to be irrational, you are literally cutting yourself. You are operating with only half of your real power. You are using only half of the intelligence that is available to you. Jung saw this as a profound tragedy because he understood that this division, this rejection of the unconscious was not natural, it was not inevitable, created, it was taught. It was imposed by culture, by education, by society. And when you can see this, when you can recognize that this division is artificial, that it was created by forces external to you, you gain the possibility of doing something radical. You gain the possibility of refusing to participate in this division. You gain the possibility of refusing to reject half of yourself. You gain the possibility of becoming whole. But how do you do that? How do you begin to hear that silenced voice? How do you reestablish dialogue with the exiled part of yourself? How do you integrate what is separated? These were the questions Jung spent decades investigating, and the answers he found were not simple. They were not easy. They were absolutely transformative. Because when Jung finally managed to articulate the method, when he finally managed to put into words the path that led back to wholeness, he was describing nothing less than the key to unlocking the true power. Are you ready to discover what Jung discovered? Are you ready to learn the secret that has been kept from most people? Are you ready to begin listening to that silent voice within you that has been trying to communicate with you your whole life? Because what follows is not just theory, it's not just philosophy, it's a map. A precise map that shows exactly how you can access that vast intelligence, that ancestral wisdom, that infinite power that lies dormant within you. And when you can read that map, when you can follow that path, when you can awaken what is sleeping, nothing in your life will ever be the same. Jung had an understanding that was revolutionary for his, and that remains revolutionary today, perhaps even more so than ever. An understanding that challenges everything you've been taught to believe about the nature of the human mind. He understood that the mind is not divided between good and evil, between conscious and unconscious, between rational and irrational, as if they were two cities separated by an insurmountable wall. On the contrary, the human mind is an integrated whole. It is an eternal dance between complementary opposites. It is like a river that can only flow because there is a left bank and right bank, because there is water and land, because there is movement and resistance. Remove one of the banks and the river ceases to be a river. Remove the resistance and the water ceases to have form. Jung called this the integration of opposites, and it was absolutely central to his vision of how the psyche really works, how the brain really processes information, how you can really access speeds of thought that transcend conventional logic. Look, you've been taught to distrust your unconscious since the moment you were born. When you were a child and had an irrational fear, your parents said it was nonsense. When you had an intuition about something, the adults around you said you should think with your head, not your heart. When you had a vivid dream, you were taught to dismiss it as irrelevant, as mere neural noise, as a random sequence of images created by a bored brain during sleep. And when you had an impulse, a will, a desire that didn't fit the image you wanted to present to the world, you learned to repress it, hide it, to deny its existence. You were taught to value only logical, rational, and verifiable thought. You were taught that reason was good and intuition was suspect, that logic was reliable, feeling was deceptive, that the conscious was real and the unconscious was an illusion. But Jung saw this as a profound tragedy, because when you reject half of who you are, when you systematically deny the unconscious, when you create a division within yourself and declare war against one of the halves, you are literally cutting yourself in half, operating with only half of your real. And more than that, you're using an immense amount of energy to maintain this division, to maintain this internal war, to constantly repress that part of yourself you have decided is not acceptable. Think about what this means in practice. Think of a man who has been taught since childhood that anger is unacceptable, that real men don't get angry, that anger is a sign of weakness. So this man spends his entire life repressing his anger. Every time something frustrates him, every time someone disrespects him, every time he is treated unfairly, he swallows that anger, he buries it, he denies it. And this anger doesn't disappear. It stays there, fermenting, accumulating, creating ever-increasing internal pressure. And this pressure is using an enormous amount of energy that could be used to create, to innovate, to solve problems, to live fully. But instead, this energy is being wasted in an internal conflict, is being used to fight against himself. Or consider a woman who has been taught that ambition is unfeminine, that real women should be modest, should put themselves second, serve others. So this woman spends her entire life suppressing her ambition. Every time she has a big dream, every time she feels the desire to achieve something meaningful, every time she wants to stand out, She holds back. She minimizes herself. She denies that impulse. And again, this energy that could be used to create something extraordinary is being wasted in internal conflict. It's being used to fight against herself. Jung understood that the unconscious is not the opposite of the conscious. It is not an enemy. It is not something you need to defeat or subdue. It is complementary. It is like day and night, like light and shadow, like masculine and feminine, like the breath that goes in and the breath that goes. Each exists in relation to the other. Each gives meaning to the other. And when you manage to integrate these opposites, you manage to create harmony between them. When you manage to stop fighting against yourself and instead start dancing with yourself, something extraordinary happens. You access an intelligence that is much greater than the sum of its parts. Jung described this using a concept he called synchronicity. And synchronicity wasn't about causality in the traditional sense. It wasn't about cause and effect. It was about something much more mysterious. It was about a deep connection between the inner psyche and the outer world. As if the inner universe and the outer universe, constant dialogue and constant communication. As if there were a secret language through which they spoke to each other. And when you can tune into that communication, when you can hear what the universe is trying to tell you through symbols, through dreams, through apparent coincidences, you gain access to a form of intelligence that completely transcends rational logic. Imagine you're facing a problem at work, a problem you've been trying to solve for weeks using only logic and rational analysis. You've made lists, you've created spreadsheets, you've analyzed every aspect of the problem, but nothing works. The solution keeps eluding you. Then, one night, you have a vivid dream, a strange dream, one that makes no rational sense. But when you wake up, when you think about that dream, you suddenly see the problem in a completely different way. You see a connection you've never seen before. You see a solution that is elegant, that's simple, that is absolutely obvious once you can see it. This is not coincidence. This is synchronicity. This is your unconscious working behind the scenes, processing information much faster and much more efficiently than your conscious mind ever could, and then communicating the solution to you through a symbol, through an image, through a dream. Jung called the patterns that emerge from the unconscious archetypes. Archetypes were not random created. They were not specific to one person or culture. They were universal patterns that repeated themselves throughout human history, across all cultures, across all civilizations. The hero, sage, the lover, the creator, shadow, self. These patterns appeared in ancient myths. They appeared in fairy tales. They appeared in people's dreams. They appeared in art, literature, and music, as if there were a universal language that completely transcended cultural and linguistic differences. And when you understand the archetypes, recognize them in your dreams, in your fantasies, intuitions, you begin to see reality in a completely different way. You begin to realize that there is a profound order beneath the apparent chaos. You begin to realize that there is an intelligence guiding you. And here is the crucial point that Jung wanted you to understand. When you manage to integrate these opposites, when you manage to stop rejecting half of yourself, when you manage to create harmony between the conscious and the unconscious, you not only increase the speed of your brain, you completely change the way it works. You completely change the way you process information. Completely change the way you see the world, because now you're no longer relying solely on step-by-step logical analysis. Now you have access to a form of processing that is parallel, simultaneous, that is holistic. Your unconscious is constantly processing information behind the scenes, constantly making connections. It's constantly recognizing. And when you learn to listen to what it has to say, when you learn to trust those messages that come through intuition, through dreams, through synchronicities, you gain access to a speed of thought that is simply supernatural. But there is a price. There is always a price. Jung knew this very well. Because when you begin to integrate opposites, when you begin to accept that part of yourself that you rest, when you begin to listen to that voice that has been silenced, you will encounter resistance. Not just external resistance from other people who are invested in keeping you divided, but internal resistance. Because that part of you that has been repressed will not simply appear as a friend, appear as a wild force. It will appear as everything you fear. It will appear as the shadow. And when you finally manage to look the shadow in the eye, when you finally manage to recognize that part of yourself that you have denied throughout life, you will discover something that is simultaneously frightening, liberating. You will discover that that shadow contains immense power, a power that you can use to create, to transform, to awaken the true potential that lies dormant within you. But how do you do that? How do you integrate something you've spent your whole life denying? How do you accept what you've got to reject? These are the questions that lead directly to the deepest secret Jung kept. A secret that will completely change how you understand yourself and how you live your life. Carl Jung was a man who deeply believed in something that modern science had completely discarded, that God communicates through symbols, not through words, not through logic, not through rational arguments that you could debate or question, but through images, patterns, through meanings that completely transcend rational language and speak directly to the part of you that is deeper than the conscious mind. And when Jung began to study the symbols that emerged from his patient's dreams, when he began to explore the myths of ancient cultures, when he began to investigate medieval alchemy, he discovered something that would forever change how we understand communication between the conscious and unconscious. He discovered that symbols are not arbitrary. They are not random creations of the mind. On the contrary, symbols are the language through which the unconscious communicates conscious. They are the voice of the divine speaking through the human psyche. How do you recognize a symbol? How do you differentiate a true symbol from a simple random image? This is a question most people never ask themselves, because most people have been taught to completely ignore symbols. They have been taught to see a dream as just a dream, a coincidence as just a coincidence, a recurring image as just a chance occurrence. But Jung knew that this was a form of blindness, a cultivated blindness that prevents us from seeing reality as it truly is. True symbol is something that touches you on a level that transcends rational understanding. It is something you cannot fully explain, but that you feel is profoundly significant. Something that appears repeatedly in your life, in your fantasies, dreams, as if desperately trying to get your attention. It is something that, when you see it, triggers an emotional reaction that is disproportionate to the object itself. Color, a shape, creature, scene. Something that makes your heart race, something that makes your skin crawl, something you can't stop thinking about. Think of a symbol that appears repeatedly in your life. Maybe it's an animal, maybe it's a color, maybe it's a number, maybe it's a situation that strangely repeats itself. Have you ever stopped to think about why this symbol keeps appearing? Have you considered that perhaps it's not a coincidence, that perhaps there's an intelligence behind it trying to communicate? Jung believed so. Jung believed that every symbol that appeared in your life was a message from the unconscious. It was the self, that archetypal center of the psyche, trying to guide you towards something you needed to understand, something you needed to integrate, something you needed to awaken within yourself. Jung spent years studying alchemical symbols, and that may seem strange. It may seem that a 20th century man, a scientist, a psychologist, was wasting his time on something as archaic, seemingly irrelevant as medieval alchemy. But Jung saw something that most people couldn't see. He saw that alchemy wasn't about turning lead into gold in the literal sense. It wasn't about material chemistry. It was about transforming the raw matter of the human psyche into spiritual. It was about the great work, the opus magnum, which is the complete integration of the psyche, the reconciliation of all opposites with itself. The ancient alchemists, unknowingly, were describing the process of individuation. They were mapping the path to wholeness. They were leaving a coded map for those who had eyes to see. How do you begin to work with symbols? How do you begin to decode this sacred language that the unconscious is trying to speak to you? Jung developed a method he called symbol amplification, and this method was completely different from the traditional interpretation which was popular in his time. Traditional interpretation tried to find a fixed meaning for each symbol. The horse means strength, water means emotion, the house means the sun. As if there were a dictionary of symbols you could. But Jung knew this was a dangerous simplification, because a symbol doesn't have a single universal meaning. A symbol has multiple layers of each layer reveals something different. Each layer deepens understanding. Amplification works like this. You take a symbol that appeared in your dream, or in your life, or in your imagination, and instead of trying to interpret it rigidly, you explore it. You examine it from all angles. You ask, what does this symbol mean to me personally? What is my personal association with it? How do I feel when I see this symbol? What is the cultural history of this? How does it appear in different myths and different traditions? What is the archetypal pattern behind this symbol? And when you do this, when you allow the symbol to reveal itself through multiple layers of meaning, you begin to understand the message that the unconscious is trying to convey. It's like peeling an onion, layer after layer, and in each layer, you discover something new about yourself, something new about the nature of reality, something new about the deeper meaning of your life. Have you ever had a dream that left you disturbed for days? A dream you couldn't stop thinking of? A dream that seemed so real, so meaningful that you knew it wasn't just a dream? Well, Jung believed that this dream was a message from your unconscious self, trying to communicate with you about something absolutely crucial to your life. And when you learn to amplify the symbols of that dream, when you learn to explore each image in depth, you begin to understand what that dream. Perhaps it was a warning. Perhaps it was encouragement. Perhaps it was a revelation about who you really are. Perhaps it was a call to awaken. But there's something even deeper happening. Something Jung understood that completely changed how he viewed the relationship between the psyche and external reality. When you start working with symbols in this way, when you start taking your dreams seriously, when you start paying attention to the synchronicities that occur in your life, you begin to realize that there is an intelligence guiding you, not an external intelligence, not a distant god in the sky watching far, but an internal intelligence. Self, that archetypal center within you that knows exactly where you need to go, exactly what you need to do, exactly how you need to evolve. And here's the point most people fail to grasp. This intelligence isn't trying to deceive you. It's not trying to confuse you. It's trying to help you. It's trying to guide you toward your true nature. It's trying to awaken you from a sleep you didn't even know you were in. The symbols that appear in your dreams, the synchronicities that occur in your life, the intuitions you have, all of these are ways through which this intelligence is communicating with you. And when you can tune into this communication, when you can hear the silent voice that speaks through the symbols, you gain access to a form of knowledge that is far deeper, far truer than anything you could gain through rational. But there is an obstacle that Jung faced repeatedly throughout his career. An obstacle that most people face when they begin to work symbols. Because when you start to take symbols seriously, when you start to recognize that there is an intelligence behind them, you're beginning to question the reality you have been taught. You're beginning to question the materialistic worldview that dominates modern Western culture. You're beginning to suggest that there is something beyond the physical, something beyond the measure, something that completely transcends conventional scientific, and that is frightening. Because if that is true, then everything you believed to be secure, everything you believed you stood, begins to crumble. Jung knew this. He knew there was a price to pay for Rub's truths, because there are powerful forces that have an interest in keeping you ignorant of the symbols. There are powerful forces that have an interest in keeping you disconnected from your. There are powerful forces that have an interest in keeping you asleep. Because a person who can decode the symbols, a person who can communicate with conscious, a person who can hear the voice of the self, is a person who is very difficult to control. It is a person who has access to a form of knowledge that completely transcends propaganda, manipulation, and social conditioning. So Jung made a choice that cost him dearly, a choice that isolated him from many of his colleagues, a choice that made him be seen as a man who had betrayed science, who had become a mystic, who had lost his reason. But Jung knew he was right. He knew he had discovered something fundamental about the nature of the human mind. He knew he had found the key to awakening the true power that lies dormant within a person. And he dedicated the rest of his life to revealing that key, translating that sacred language of symbols into words that could be understood by the rational mind. How do you begin? How do you start working with symbols in your own life? How do you begin to hear the voice of the unconscious that is speaking through them? The answer is simple, but it requires courage. It requires you to be willing to question everything you believe safe. It requires you to be willing to explore the depths of your own psyche. It requires you to be willing to face what you hear. Because it is precisely in what you fear that the most important message lies. It is precisely in what you avoid that the key to your transformation lies. It is precisely in what you deny that the power you need to awaken resides. Carl Jung had a profound understanding of something most people spend their entire lives avoiding with all their might. An understanding that wasn't merely theoretical. It was a lived, embodied understanding, gained through decades of introspective work that pushed him to the limits of sanity. Jung knew that each of us carries within us a shadow, a part of ourselves that we repress, a part that we hide even from ourselves. And this shadow wasn't something Jung had read about in a book. It was something he had personally confronted. It was something that almost destroyed him. And it was precisely in this encounter with the shadow that he discovered the most powerful secret to awakening true mental speed. When Jung was 42, he suffered a profound crisis, a crisis that his biographers describe as a psychological break. But Jung didn't see it that way. For him, that crisis was an initiation. It was a descent into hell. It was a necessary journey for those who truly wanted to understand the human psyche. During this crisis, Jung had disturbing dreams. He had visions. He had encounters with figures that emerged from the dead, figures that frightened him, figures that fascinated him, figures that called him to a journey he hadn't chosen, but that he knew was absolutely necessary. And when Jung finally managed to integrate these experiences, when he managed to make sense of these encounters with the unconscious, he had an understanding that no psychology book could have given him. He had an understanding of the shadow that was simultaneously terrifying and liberating. The shadow is everything you don't want to. It's everything you've been taught to suppress. It's everything that conflicts with the image you want to present to the world. You were taught to be polite, so you repressed your anger. You were taught to be generous, so you repressed your greed. You were taught to be honest, so you repressed your lies. You were taught to be strong, so you repressed your fear. You were taught to be independent, so you repressed your need for connection. And with each repression, you cut off a part of yourself. With each denial, you lost a piece of it. But here's the crucial point Jung wanted you to understand. This shadow doesn't disappear. It doesn't dissolve. It stays there, in the basements of the psyche, fermenting, accumulating energy, waiting for an opportunity to emerge. And when the shadow finally emerges, when it manages to break through the barriers you built to contain it, it doesn't appear as a gentle friend. It appears as a savage force. It appears as everything you fear. It appears as your worst instincts. It appears as what you most deny in yourself. A man who has spent his entire life repressing his anger suddenly finds himself having violent thoughts that frighten him. A woman who has spent her entire life being submissive suddenly feels an urge to dominate, control, to conquer. A person who sees themselves as altruistic suddenly recognizes deep greed within. A person who sees themselves as honest suddenly realizes that they constantly lie, manipulate, and deceive. And when that happens, when you finally manage to see the shadow in all its darkness, it's as if the ground disappears beneath you. But Jung understood something revolutionary that most psychologists of his time couldn't grasp. He understood that the shadow is not something bad. The shadow is not an enemy you need to beat. The shadow is not a disease you need to cure. The shadow is a legitimate part of who you are. The shadow contains energy. The shadow contains power. The shadow contains an immense amount of creative potential that is being wasted in repression. And the only way to truly become powerful, the only way to truly access the full speed of your brain, is to integrate the shadow. It's not about destroying the shadow. It's not about denying the shadow. It's about recognizing the shadow, accepting the shadow, integrating the shadow as a legitimate part of who you are. Think of an aspect of yourself that you completely reject, something you don't want to admit you are. Maybe you're more selfish than you'd like to be. Maybe you're more aggressive than you'd like to be. Maybe you're lazier than you'd like to be. Maybe you're more sexually driven than you'd like to admit. Maybe you're more ambitious than you'd like to confess. Maybe you're more cowardly than you'd. Now, instead of continuing to deny it, instead of continuing to repress it, Jung said you should do the opposite. You should acknowledge it. You should accept it. You should integrate it as a legitimate part of who you are. Because when you do that, when you manage to fully accept who you are with all your darkness, with all your light, with all your complexity, something magical happens. You gain access to an immense amount of energy that was being used to press, to deny, to fight against yourself. This energy is now available to be creatively, constructively, in a way that serves its true purpose. A man who manages to integrate his anger does not become a violent person. He becomes a person who has access to an inner strength that can be used to defend what is important, to establish healthy boundaries, to act with determination when necessary. A woman who manages to integrate her desire for power does not become a manipulative person. She becomes a person who has access to a capacity for leadership, influence, and creation that was previously inaccessible. A person who manages to integrate their greed does not become a miserly person. They become a person who has access to a desire to live fully, to enjoy the fruits of life, to be abundant. There is a price. There is always a price. And Jung knew this very well. Because when you begin to integrate the shadow, you begin to accept that part of yourself that you have repressed, you will encounter resistance. You will encounter fear. You will encounter guilt. You will encounter shame. Because you were taught that that part of you is unacceptable. You were taught that that part of you is evil. You were taught that that part of you is dangerous. And when you begin to recognize that that part of you exists, when you begin to accept that that part of you is real, you are challenging everything you have been taught. You are challenging the morality that has been imposed on you. You are challenging the image you have built of yourself. Jung described this as the process of individuation. And individuation wasn't about becoming a better person. It wasn't about becoming more moral. It wasn't about becoming more socially acceptable. Individuation was about becoming who you truly are. It was about integrating all aspects of yourself into a coherent whole. It was about becoming a whole person. And this process wasn't easy, painful. It required courage, it required radical honesty with yourself. But it was absolutely necessary if you truly wanted to awaken the power that was within you. There's a fascinating story about Jung that perfectly illustrates what he was trying to communicate. During an analysis session with one of his patients, a man who considered himself a completely moral, completely ethical, completely good person, Jung asked something that seemed simple, but was deeply disturbing. Jung asked, "Have you ever desired something that you know is wrong? Have you ever had a thought that frightened you? Have you ever felt an impulse that completely conflicts with the image you have of yourself?" The patient initially denied it completely. He said no, that he was a good person, that he didn't have those thoughts, that he didn't have those impulses. But Jung insisted. Jung knew he was lying. Jung knew that every human being has a shadow. And finally, after weeks of analysis, the patient began to reveal the thoughts that frightened him, the desires he had repressed, the impulses he had denied. And when he finally managed to talk about these, when he finally managed to acknowledge that they existed within him, Something extraordinary happened. He felt freer than he had ever felt in his entire life. Jung knew that this was the true key to mental speed. It wasn't about developing greater power of concentration. It wasn't about learning memorization technique. It wasn't about training the brain to process information faster. It was about releasing the energy that was being wasted on internal conflict. It was about creating harmony within oneself. It was about becoming an integrated person, a complete person, a person who had access to the full range of their psychic powers. Because when you are no longer divided against yourself, when you're no longer using half your energy to fight against the other half, you are free, you are whole, you are unified. And it is in this state of unification that true mental speed emerges. But there is something even deeper happening, something Jung discovered through his own encounters with the shadow. When you manage to integrate the shadow, when you manage to fully accept who you are, you not only gain access to more energy, you gain access to a form of wisdom that is far deeper than anything you could obtain through rational analysis. Because the shadow contains the memory of the body. The shadow contains ancestral instincts. The shadow contains the wisdom that has been accumulated over thousands of years of human evolution. When you manage to access this wisdom, when you manage to hear what the shadow has to say, you gain access to a form of knowledge that is simultaneously very ancient, new, very primitive, and very sophisticated, very animal and very divine. And here is the final point that Jung wanted you to understand. When you manage to integrate the shadow, when you manage to fully accept who you are, you don't become a bad person. You don't become a person who acts impulsively, who harms others, who follows their wild instincts without. On the contrary, you become a person who has access to the full range of your human capability. You become a person who can consciously choose how to act. You become a person who has access to both compassion and strength, both gentleness and determination, both love and anger, both creativity and destruction. And when you have access to this entire range, when you manage to integrate all these aspects of yourself, you become truly powerful. You become truly free. You become truly capable of accessing the full speed of your brain. Jung had an understanding that troubled him throughout, an understanding that isolated him from many of his colleagues, an understanding that made him be seen as a man who had betrayed science, who had become a mystic, who had lost his mind. But Jung knew he was right. He knew he had discovered something fundamental about the nature, and more importantly, he knew why this knowledge had been kept away from most people. He knew there were powerful forces that had an interest in keeping you ignorant. There were powerful forces that had an interest in keeping you divided. There were powerful forces that had an interest in keeping you asleep. And when Jung finally managed to articulate why this was happening, when he managed to reveal the mechanism through which this knowledge was suppressed, he was describing nothing less than the best-kept secret of Western civilization. The reason why integrating the unconscious, the reason why working with the shadow, the reason why accessing the self is considered a forbidden secret is because institutions of power have a vested interest in keeping you dependent on linear and rational thinking. Think about that for a moment. Think about the education system. Think about how you were taught. From the moment you were born, you were placed in a system that valued only one way of thinking, the logical way, the rational way, the way that can be measured, tested, verified. Anything that didn't fit into that way of thinking was discarded, called irrelevant, called unscientific, called superstition. But why? Why did the educational system choose to value only this way of thinking? Why did the system choose to discard intuition, creativity, the wisdom of the unconscious? The answer is simple, but deeply disturbing. Because a person who can only access linear and rational thought is a person who is easy to control. A person who can only access linear and rational thought is a person who can be taught to accept information without questioning it. A person who can only access linear and rational thought is a person who can be manipulated through logic, through arguments, through data. But a person who can access the true speed of their brain, a person who can solve problems intuitively and creatively, a person who can hear the voice of the self, a person who can work with a shadow and integrate opposites, that is a person who is very difficult to control. Because that person has access to a form of knowledge that completely transcends propaganda. That person has access to a form of wisdom that cannot be taught in a class. That person has access to an intelligence that is much faster and much more accurate than any information that could be transmitted through traditional channels. And when a person can access this form of knowledge, when they can trust it, when they can act based on it, that person becomes independent. That person no longer needs experts to validate their ideas. That person no longer needs external authorities to tell them what is right or wrong. that person becomes truly self-sufficient, and that's terrifying for any system that really. Think about how much money is spent on formal education. Think about how much money is spent on courses, certifications, and experts who supposedly have the answers. Think about how much money is spent on therapy, medication, and external solutions that supposedly will solve your problems. Billions, trillions. And all of this is based on the premise that you don't have the answers within yourself, that you need someone external to validate, teach, guide, that you are fundamentally incapable of trusting yourself, that you need external authorities to know what is true and what is false. But what if the truth were the opposite? What if you already had all the answers? What if your subconscious already knew exactly how to solve your problems? What if the self already had a perfect plan for your life? What if the only thing you needed to do was learn to listen to that quiet voice inside you? Well, that would be a revolution. That would be dangerous for the status quo, because it would mean you wouldn't need anyone and you would be free. And freedom is the scariest thing for a system that benefits from your. Jung understood this very well. He understood that there was a reason why schools didn't teach about the integration of the unconscious with the conscious. He understood that there was a reason why traditional psychologists focused on pathologizing the unconscious instead of celebrating its power. He understood that there was a reason why society valued only logical thought. Because a population that can access its own inner power is a population that cannot be. A population that can solve its own problems is a population that doesn't need intermediaries. A population that can hear the voice of the self, a population that cannot be manipulated through propaganda, fear. And that's why Jung was so attacked. That's why he was accused of being unscientific. That's why he was isolated because he was revealing something that the institutions of power didn't want. Showing that there was another way of thinking. There was another way of accessing knowledge. There was another way of living. And this other way was far more powerful than anything the traditional educational system offer. But there's more. There's something even deeper happening. Because when you can access the true speed of your brain, when you can integrate the unconscious, when you can work with the shadow, you don't just become independent. You become dangerous. Not dangerous in the sense that you will harm others, but dangerous in the sense that you can no longer be deceived, you can no longer be manipulated, you can no longer be controlled through fear, through guilt, through shame, because you have access to a form of wisdom that knows the truth. And when you know the truth, when you can see through the illusions, when you can recognize the lies that are being told to you, you become a threat to any system that depends on those. Jung saw this happen repeatedly throughout his career. He saw patients who began to integrate the shadow, who began to access the self, who began to trust their own inner wisdom, began to question the social structures that surrounded them. They began to question authority. They began to question the morality that had been imposed upon them. They began to live more authentically, more honestly, more in line with who they truly were. And when this happened, when these people began to live this way, they often encountered resistance. Resistance from family, resistance from society, resistance from all the institutions that had an interest in keeping them asleep, divided, dependent. There is a disturbing account about Jung that perfectly illustrates what was happening. During World War II, Jung was asked why he hadn't done more to prevent the rise of Nazism. And Jung responded with an honesty that was both frightening and revealing. He said that Nazism was possible because people had been taught not to trust themselves. They had been taught to distrust their intuition. They had been taught to follow external authorities without question. They had been taught to deny the shadow instead of integrating it. And when you deny the shadow, when you repress that part of yourself that is capable of doing terrible things, you don't eliminate it, you only bury it. And when it finally emerges, when it manages to break through the barriers you have built, it emerges with devastating force. And it is at that moment that people are capable of committing atrocities. It is at that moment that crowds can be manipulated into doing things they would normally consider. Jung was saying something very profound. He was saying that the integration of the shadow wasn't just about individual mental health. It was about collective mental health. It was about the possibility of world peace. Because a humanity that manages to integrate the shadow, that manages to fully accept who it is, manages to access the self, is a humanity that cannot be manipulated, or it is a humanity that cannot be deceived. It is a humanity that is truly free. And that's why this knowledge has been suppressed. That's why institutions of power have an interest in keeping you ignorant. Because when you can access the true speed of your brain, when you can integrate the unconscious, when you can work with the shadow, you become free. And freedom is the most dangerous thing for any system that depends on your enslavement. Now you know. Now you understand. And this understanding changes everything. Because once you know you've been deceived, once you know there's another way of thinking, once you know there's a power within you hidden, you can no longer pretend you don't know. You can no longer go back to sleep. You're awake. And the question now is no longer whether you can access this. The question is, will you actually take the step to activate the true power of your brain? Because the answer to that question lies in what comes next. And it's an answer that will completely transform how you see yourself and how you. There comes a moment in everyone's life when everything changes. It's not a moment you can plan. It's not a moment you can anticipate. It's a moment that simply arrives. It's when you finally get to see through the illusion, when you finally get to hear the voice that's been speaking inside you. It's when you finally understand that you already have everything you are already complete, that you already have access to all the intelligence, all the wisdom, all the power you could ever need. The only thing standing between you and the full realization of your potential is the willingness to wake up. It's the willingness to listen. It's the willingness to trust. Carl Jung spent his whole life trying to understand, and knowing changes everything. Jung knew that most people spent their entire lives asleep, living in a state of unconsciousness, playing roles assigned to them, following scripts written by others, living lives that weren't truly their own. But he also knew that there was a calling within each person, a silent voice constantly trying to awaken. That voice was the self. And when you can hear that voice, when you can answer that calling, you embark on a journey that is the most significant, the most challenging, the most transformative you could ever undertake. That journey is what Jung called individuation, and it's a lifelong work, but it's a worthwhile work. It's a work that transforms everything. How do you begin? Jung said you begin simply by paying attention to your dreams, paying attention to the synchronicities that occur, paying attention to those silent voices that speak through symbols, through images, feelings you can't rationally explain. Start today. Start now. Start keeping a dream journal, not to interpret them rigidly, but to amplify them, to explore the symbols in depth, to allow them to reveal themselves through multiple layers of meaning. Because every symbol that appears in your dreams is a message from the self. It is the divine trying to communicate with you. And when you learn to listen to these messages, you learn to decode this sacred language, you gain access to a form of knowledge that is far deeper than anything you could learn in a classroom. Begin to acknowledge the shadow. Begin to accept the parts of yourself that you are afraid to acknowledge. Begin to integrate what you have repressed. Because it is in this integration that true power resides. It is in this complete acceptance of who you are, all your darkness, all your light, with all your complexity, that you gain access to the totality of your being. Make a list. Write down all the things you don't want to be, all the qualities you reject in yourself, all the parts of yourself that you deny. And then, in a moment of courage, in a moment of radical honesty, acknowledge that these things exist within you, that they are real, that they are legitimate, that they are part of who you are. Because when you can do this, when you can fully accept who you are, you release an immense amount of energy that was being wasted in repression. Start living synchronistically. Start paying attention to apparent coincidences. Start recognizing that there are no coincidences, only synchronicities, communications from the self through the circumstances of life. Start trusting these communications. Start following the guidance of the self, because the self knows. The self always knows. When you have a strong intuition about something, when you feel there is an intelligence guiding you, when you notice patterns repeating in your life, that is not chance. That is the self communicating with you. That is the universe speaking through the circumstances. And when you learn to recognize these communications, when you learn to trust them, when you learn to follow the guidance they offer, you become an instrument through which cosmic intelligence can express itself. And when you do that, when you really start doing that work, you really start waking up, something extraordinary happens. The speed of your brain doesn't just increase, it transforms. It becomes an expression of the divine. You're no longer just processing information, you're channeling cosmic intelligence, becoming an instrument through which the universe can know itself. Decisions that once took weeks to make begin to be made in minutes. Problems that seemed impossible to solve begin to reveal elegant and simple solutions. Creativity you thought you didn't have begins to flow naturally. Relationships that were stagnant begin to transform. Work that seemed meaningless begins to gain purpose. Life that seemed gray begins to gain color. Jung had a vision that was simultaneously humble and grand. He believed that each person had a unique role to play in the great cosmic drama, that each person had a destiny, vocation, calling, and that when you manage to answer that calling, when you manage to live in harmony with the self, you are not just living a meaningful life. You are participating in the continuous creation of the universe. You're helping to bring the divine into manifestation in the material world. You are fulfilling your true purpose. And it is in this fulfillment of purpose that you find true, not the superficial happiness that comes from consumption, status, external recognition, but the profound happiness that comes from living in harmony with who you truly are. This is what Jung wanted you. This is what he dedicated his entire life to reveal. That you are not an accident, that you are not insignificant, that you are not limited by the circumstances of your birth or the limitation of mind, that within you exists infinite power, infinite wisdom, infinite creativity, and that when you can access this power, when you can hear the voice of the self, when you can answer the call of individuation, you become truly free. You become truly powerful. You become truly capable of accessing the full speed of your brain, living the life you always knew was possible to live. So the question Jung leaves you with now is this: are you ready to awaken? Are you ready to hear the silent voice of the self that is speaking within you at this very moment? Are you ready to embark on the journey of individuation, to become who you truly are, to realize your true potential? If the answer is yes, I want you to comment below. Not just any comment. I want you to reveal what aspect of yourself you are afraid to acknowledge. What shadow have you been pressing? What call from the self have you been ignoring? You can comment anonymously if you prefer. You can use a pseudonym. But what matters is that you put it into words. Because when you put it into words, when you share it with the world, you activate a force within you that immediately begins to work to bring integration, to bring healing, to bring transformation. If this video touched something within you, if you felt that silent calling, if you recognized the voice of the self speaking through, please give it a like, because that like isn't just a gesture, an acknowledgement. It's an affirmation that you are ready to awaken. It's a declaration that you're willing to do work. It's a signal to the algorithm that this content is important, that it needs to reach more people who are ready to awaken their true power. Because there are millions of people sleeping right now. There are millions of people who don't know there's another way to think. There are millions of people who don't know they already have everything they need. When you give a like, when you share this video, you're helping to awaken these people. You're helping to bring light to those who are still in darkness. And if you want to continue this journey, want to learn more about how to integrate your unconscious with your conscious mind, if you want to discover the secrets that the greatest geniuses in history used, if you want to learn how to work with the shadow, if you want to learn how to listen to the voice of the self, then subscribe to the channel now, because I will continue revealing these secrets that change the way the greatest geniuses in history used their minds. Secrets that will completely transform the way you think, how you create, how you live. I will bring more videos about Jung, about depth psychology, individuation. I will share practical techniques that you can use immediately to begin integrating the. I will reveal the synchronicities that occur when you begin to awaken. I will show how ordinary people like you, manage to transform their lives when they begin to listen to the voice of the self. The choice is yours. The power is within you. Start now. Don't put it off. Because every moment you spend sleeping is a moment you are losing. It's a moment you are not living fully. It's a moment you are not expressing your true potential. But every moment you wake up, every moment you hear the voice of the self, every moment you integrate the shadow, every moment you work with the symbols, the moment you are becoming who you truly are. It's a moment you are becoming free. It's a moment you are participating in the continuous creation of the universe. So start now. Comment below, like, subscribe to the channel, and embark on the most important journey of your life. The journey back home, the journey back to yourself, the journey back to the self. Because you are already complete. You are already whole. You are already sacred. You just need to wake up and recognize it.